Every parent's worst nightmare became Will Harlan's reality on a snowy Tuesday afternoon. His 6-year-old son, Max, vanished from the neighborhood park without a trace, leaving behind only a red mitten and a father's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. For 3 months, the small town of Cedar Falls whispered. The police searched everywhere, but no one thought to look beneath the neighbor's old doghouse. Harold Brennan seemed harmless, a quiet widower who brought casseroles and joined the search parties. He lived just 20 yards from Will's house, close enough to hear Max's bedtime stories through thin walls. When Will's dog started clawing at the frozen ground near Harold's weathered doghouse, Will almost ignored it. But something felt wrong. What he found beneath those rotted boards changed everything. A trapdoor, a ladder, and deep underground his son, alive but terrified. The rescue shocked everyone. But what Max whispered to his father in that hospital room was even more disturbing. The voice that called his name in the park that day wasn't a stranger's. It was someone he trusted. But why had Max been too scared to scream? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Will Harlan had learned to measure his days, not in hours, but in the spaces between worry. At 34, he carried the weight of single parenthood like a man twice his age. Shoulders perpetually hunched from bending down to 6-year-old Max's level, back aching from the double shifts that kept their modest 2-bedroom rental afloat. The house on Maple Street wasn't much, peeling paint on the front porch. A kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times he tightened it, and walls thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the shared wall. But it was theirs, and more importantly, it was Max's. The boy had claimed the smaller bedroom facing the backyard, where he could watch the seasons change through a window he decorated with crayon drawings of their little family. 2 stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. 4 years had passed since Sarah's accident, though Will still caught himself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning or saving the funny parts of his day to share with someone who would never again laugh at his stories. The drunk driver who'd taken her had walked away with minor injuries and a suspended license. Will had walked away with a 2-year-old who asked for mama every night for 6 months. And the crushing realization that love alone wouldn't pay the bills or fix broken. Refrigerator Cedar Falls was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' middle names. Population 8,400, give or take the college kids who came and went with the seasons. Main Street boasted a hardware store where Will worked mornings, a diner where he pulled evening shifts 3 nights a week, and a library that still used the honor system for late fees. It was the sort of town that appeared on postcards. White church steeples piercing winter skies, autumn leaves carpeting tree-lined streets, children riding bicycles without helmets because the most dangerous thing around was Mrs. Patterson's aggressive Yorkshire Terrier. "Daddy, look." Max's voice carried across their small backyard as Will fumbled with his keys, home from his hardware store shift with paint under his fingernails and sawdust in his hair. The boy had built an elaborate snow fort against the back fence, complete with turrets and a flag made from one of Will's old work shirts. At 6, Max possessed the kind of boundless creativity that turned cardboard boxes into spaceships and puddles into oceans. His copper-red hair, Sarah's hair, caught the late afternoon light as he waved from behind his frozen fortress. "That's some fine architecture, buddy," Will called back, meaning it. Max had inherited Sarah's artistic eye, along with her hair, covering every available surface in their house with drawings that Will couldn't bear to throw away. The refrigerator gallery had expanded to include the kitchen cabinets and most of one hallway wall. Inside, Will started the evening routine that had become second nature. Check the mail, bills mostly. Start dinner, usually something involving pasta or rice that could stretch for leftovers. Help with homework. Max was learning to read, sounding out words with the same determination he applied to everything else. Then bath time, story time, and the negotiations about bedtime that Max approached like a skilled diplomat. 5 more minutes. Max would plead from his pillow, and Will would pretend to consider it seriously before settling on 3. It was their game, played out nightly, and Will treasured these moments when the day's worries faded to background noise. The neighbors had been kind, mostly. Mrs. Chen, the retired schoolteacher next door, had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to Max, arriving with homemade cookies and offering to babysit whenever Will's work schedules conflicted. Across the street, the young couple with twin babies would wave from their front porch, probably grateful that their sleepless nights would eventually end, and like Will's constant vigilance. And then there was Harold Brennan. Harold lived in the house behind theirs, separated by a chain-link fence and 30 yards of yard space that Harold maintained with obsessive precision. 63 years old, retired from 30 years with the Postal Service, Harold had moved to Cedar Falls 5 years ago after his wife died. He kept to himself, mostly, though Will occasionally saw him in his garden at odd hours, tending to vegetables that grew in unnaturally straight rows. Harold had introduced himself the day Will and Max moved in, appearing at their front door with a casserole and a soft-spoken manner that seemed genuinely neighborly. "Lost my Ellen 2 years back," he'd said simply. "Know how hard it is, raising a family alone." There was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested depths of understanding, and Will had been grateful for the kindness. Since then, Harold had been a quiet presence in their lives. He'd helped Will fix the back fence after a storm, always declining offers of payment. He'd loaned them his snow shovel when theirs broke. Sometimes Will would find small gifts on their back porch, a bag of apples from Harold's tree, a book he thought Max might enjoy, once a wooden toy car that Harold claimed to have carved himself. Max seemed to like Harold well enough, though children at 6 tend to accept adult kindness without question. "Mr. Harold says he used to have a little boy too," Max had mentioned once, but when Will asked about it, Harold had simply said, "Oh, that was a long time ago." Different life entirely. Will respected Harold's privacy. In the town where everyone knew everyone's business, Harold's quiet reserve was almost refreshing. The man had grief of his own to carry, and Will understood that some sorrows were too heavy for casual conversation. Police Chief Morrison was another matter entirely. A Cedar Falls native who'd returned after 20 years with the state police, Morrison ran the department with small-town efficiency and big-city suspicion. He'd made it clear from the beginning that he was watching Will, not unfriendly exactly, but alert to the possibility that single fathers sometimes cracked under pressure. "Lot of responsibility raising a boy alone," Morrison had said during their first encounter, when Max had wandered too far at the town fair. "Important to know your limits." Will had bristled at the implication, but held his tongue. Morrison meant well, probably, and Will couldn't afford to make enemies in a town this small. Instead, he'd made sure to be visible in his parenting, volunteering for school events, attending every parent-teacher conference, becoming the father who showed up to everything because he was the only parent Max had. The financial pressure never eased. Will's morning job at Henderson's Hardware paid decent wages, but no benefits. The evening shifts at Murphy's Diner were harder on his body, but essential for covering the extras. Max's school supplies, the occasional trip to the movies, the winter coat that grew too small every year. Some nights, Will would lie awake, calculating and recalculating their budget, moving imaginary dollars around like puzzle pieces that never quite fit. But Max never went hungry, never went without, and never doubted that his father would always be there. That was the promise Will had made to Sarah's memory and to his son. Whatever it took, they would be okay. Winter in Cedar Falls arrived like an old friend, familiar, predictable, and sometimes overstaying its welcome. This year's first real snow had started falling on a Tuesday morning in late January, the kind of heavy, wet snow that clung to tree branches and made everything look like a Christmas card. Max had pressed his face against the kitchen window during breakfast, fogging the glass with excited breath. "Can we go sledding today, Daddy? Please?" Will had looked at his son's hopeful face and felt the familiar tug between responsibility and joy. He had paperwork to catch up on, bills to organize, and Murphy's Diner needed him by 6 for the dinner rush. But Max was 6 years old, and the snow was perfect, and childhood didn't wait for convenient scheduling. After my shift at the hardware store, Will had promised, "We'll hit Riverside Park before I have to be at the diner." Max had spent the day in what Mrs. Chen later called a state of pure anticipation, checking the window every few minutes to make sure the snow hadn't melted, laying out his snow gear with military precision, and asking approximately every 20 minutes if it was time to go yet. When Will finally got home at 3:30 that Tuesday afternoon, Max was ready. More than ready. He was vibrating with excitement, his cheeks already pink from the cold he hadn't even experienced yet. "Come on, Daddy. The hill's gonna be perfect." Will looked at his son, copper hair sticking up despite attempts to tame it, green eyes bright with anticipation, wearing the blue snowsuit that Will had bought on clearance last spring and hoped would still fit. At that moment, with Max practically bouncing on his toes and the afternoon light making the fresh snow sparkle like diamonds, Will felt something he rarely allowed himself: pure, uncomplicated happiness. He should have paid attention to the other feeling too, the small nagging sense that something was different about the day. Harold hadn't been in his garden that morning, though he was usually out early tending to something or other. Mrs. Chen had mentioned seeing a strange car parked at the end of their street. Max's teacher had called to say he'd seemed distracted during class, though that could have been excitement about the snow. But Will was tired from working 2 jobs, focused on making his son happy and looking forward to an hour of pure joy on a snowy hill. He grabbed the old sled from the garage, a red plastic disc that had seen better days but still moved fast enough to make Max squeal with delight, and headed for Riverside Park, where the best sledding hill in Cedar Falls waited under a perfect blanket of snow. He had no way of knowing that someone else was waiting too. Riverside Park on a Tuesday afternoon was perfect chaos. The kind of organized mayhem that happened when fresh snow met excited children and parents who remembered what it felt like to be young. The sledding hill rose gently from the parking area, crowded with families making the most of the unexpected snow day that had sent schools home early. Will parked their old Honda near the fence, watching Max practically vibrate in his car seat as he took in the scene. Kids were everywhere, racing down the hill on everything from professional sleds to cafeteria trays, building snowmen with crooked smiles, engaged in snowball fights that knew no boundaries of age or allegiance. "There's Tommy from my class." Max pointed toward a group of first graders near the swing set. "And Mrs. Rodriguez. Can I go say hi?" "Stay where I can see you," Will called as Max scrambled out of the car, the red plastic sled dragging behind him like a faithful pet. Will grabbed the thermos of hot chocolate he'd packed and followed his son toward the hill, nodding to the other parents he recognized from school events and neighborhood gatherings. Cedar Falls parents were a particular breed, protective but not paranoid, watchful but willing to let their children explore. Most knew each other by sight, if not by name, and there was an unspoken agreement about shared supervision. If someone else's child was in trouble, you stepped in. If a kid wandered too far, you gently redirected them back to their parents. It was community parenting at its finest, built on trust and the assumption that everyone wanted the same thing: children who were safe and happy. Max made it halfway up the hill before turning back to wave at Will, his grin visible even from 30 yards away. The blue snowsuit made him easy to spot among the crowd, and Will settled onto a bench near the playground equipment where he could keep an eye on the sledding action while staying warm. "Beautiful day for this," said a voice beside him. Will turned to see Eleanor Murphy, whose family owned the diner where he worked evenings. She was watching her twin daughters build what appeared to be a snow fortress near the swings. "Max has been talking about sledding since the first snowflake fell," Will replied, pointing toward his son, who was now at the top of the hill. Positioning his sled with the seriousness of a NASCAR driver, Eleanor laughed. "Remember when the biggest decision we had to make was which hill to slide down? Will was about to respond when he noticed an elderly man struggling with grocery bags near the parking area. The bags had split, sending cans rolling across the icy pavement, while the man tried to gather them with hands that shook from cold or age or both. "I'll be right back," Will told Eleanor, jogging toward the man before any cans could roll into traffic. "Let me help you with those." The man was grateful, probably in his 70s, and it took several minutes to collect all the scattered items and transfer them to the sturdier bags Will had in his car. By the time they finished, the man was thanking Will profusely and insisting he take $5 for his trouble, money Will could use, but wouldn't accept from someone who obviously needed it more. When Will returned to the bench, Eleanor was gone, presumably following her daughters to another part of the park. The sledding hill was still crowded, but the light was beginning to change as afternoon moved toward evening. Will scanned the blue snowsuits until he found Max, or thought he did, near the bottom of the hill, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't Max at all. Just another red-haired child in winter clothes that looked similar in the fading light. "Max!" Will called, his voice carrying easily across the open space. Several children looked up, but none of them was his son. Will's heart began beating faster, though he told himself it was nothing. Max was probably on the other side of the hill, or maybe he'd gone to the bathroom in the little brick building near the parking lot. Kids move fast, especially when they were having fun, and Will had only been gone for maybe 10 minutes. But as he walked the perimeter of the sledding area, calling Max's name with increasing urgency, other parents began to notice. The organized chaos of the afternoon suddenly felt different, less playful, more frantic. "I saw him about 15 minutes ago," offered a mother whose daughter was in Max's class. "He was over by the swings, I think. The swings." Will jogged toward the playground equipment, his breath coming in short puffs that had nothing to do with the cold. The area was quieter here, most of the children having migrated to the sledding hill where the action was. A few toddlers played in the sand, under their parents' watchful eyes. But no Max. That's when he saw it, a small red mitten, the kind with the string that's supposed to keep it attached to its partner, lying in the snow beneath the swing set. Will recognized it immediately. Sarah's mother had knitted the pair last Christmas. One of the last gifts she'd made before arthritis made the fine work too difficult. Will picked up the mitten with hands that had started to shake. The yarn was slightly damp but not frozen, which meant it hadn't been there long. He looked around desperately, hoping to see Max somewhere nearby, having lost the mitten in the excitement of play. "Max!" This time Will's voice carried real panic. "Max!" Other parents were looking now, some approaching to ask if everything was okay. Eleanor Murphy appeared from somewhere, her own children trailing behind her with concerned faces. "I can't find Max," Will said, holding up the mitten. "This is his, but I can't find him anywhere." What happened next was both chaotic and organized, the way small communities respond to crisis. Eleanor immediately started organizing the other parents into search groups. Someone called the police. Others began methodically checking every possible hiding spot, behind the maintenance shed, under the playground equipment, in the bathrooms. Even in cars where a child might have crawled to get warm, Police Chief Morrison arrived within minutes, along with 2 other officers Will didn't recognize. Morrison's first questions were gentle but pointed. How long had Will been away from Max? Had anyone been paying particular attention to the boy? Were there any custody issues or family disputes that might be relevant? Will answered as clearly as he could, though his mind was starting to race in directions he didn't want it to go. 6-year-olds didn't just vanish. They wandered off, got distracted, sometimes hid when they thought they were in trouble. They didn't disappear without a trace from crowded parks in broad daylight. As the official search began, Will found himself retracing every moment of the afternoon. Max had been excited, happy, playing with the other children. There had been nothing unusual about his behavior, nothing that suggested he was upset or scared or planning to leave the area. The red sled sat abandoned at the top of the hill where Max had left it, a bright plastic reminder of the joy that had filled the afternoon just an hour before. Will stared at it as volunteers spread out across the park. In calling Max's name into the gathering dusk, Harold Brennan appeared as if from nowhere, approaching Will with the same quiet concern he'd shown when he'd first introduced himself 4 years ago. "I heard the sirens," Harold said simply. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Will looked at his neighbor, this man who had been nothing but kind, who had helped with their fence and brought Max books and carved wooden toys with patient hands. Harold's pale blue eyes reflected genuine worry, and Will felt a surge of gratitude for having someone familiar nearby during the worst moment of his life. "Max is missing," Will said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "He was sledding, and now I can't find him anywhere." Harold nodded gravely. "I'll help search." A boy Max's age couldn't have gone far, but even as Harold joined the growing group of volunteers, even as police officers expanded their search radius beyond the park boundaries, even as Will clung to the hope that his son was simply lost rather than gone, he couldn't shake the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. The red mitten in his pocket felt like evidence of a crime he couldn't yet comprehend. And the winter afternoon that had started with such promise was becoming the nightmare that would define the rest of his life. By the time full darkness fell, Max had been missing for 4 hours, and Will Harlan's world had changed forever. The police station at 3 in the morning felt like a place where hope went to die. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh institutional glow that made even healthy people look sick. Will sat in a metal chair that had been designed for discomfort, watching Detective Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, home from the city to help with the investigation, organize what was already becoming a substantial file. Max had been missing for 12 hours. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," Detective Chen said, settling across from Will with the kind of professional kindness that police officers learn to deploy like a tool. "I know this is hard, but the first 24 hours are crucial." Will nodded, though his mind felt wrapped in cotton. He'd answered these same questions for Chief Morrison, for the FBI agent who'd arrived from Portland, for the social worker who'd appeared with a clipboard and concerned expression. Each time, the questions felt more pointed, more accusatory. "Take me through your relationship with Max. Any recent changes in behavior? Problems at school? Issues with discipline?" "No." Will's voice came out hoarse from hours of calling his son's name. "Max is a good kid, happy. He does well in school, listens to his teachers. His biggest rebellion is negotiating for extra bedtime stories." Detective Chen made notes. "Financial pressures. Work stress? Anything that might have affected your parenting recently?" There it was, the question that cut closest to bone. Will straightened in his chair. "I work 2 jobs to support my son. That's not stress, that's responsibility. Max has never gone without anything he needed." "I'm not suggesting otherwise," Chen said gently. "But single parenting is hard, and sometimes people reach a breaking point without realizing it." Will stared at her. "You think I hurt my own son? I think you're a father who's going through hell, and I'm trying to find your boy." Chen leaned forward. "But I also have to consider every possibility, including ones that hurt to think about." The file on her desk was already thick with witness statements, search grid maps, and photographs of the park. Will could see his own face staring back from a driver's license photocopy, along with school pictures of Max that made his chest ache. Somewhere in that pile of paper was the red mitten, now tagged as evidence in a case that nobody wanted to believe was necessary. "Tell me about Max's routine," Chen continued. "Who has regular access to him? Babysitters, relatives, family friends?" "Mrs. Chen next door watches him sometimes when my shifts overlap." "There's no one else?" Will paused. "My wife's sister lives in California. She calls on holidays, sends birthday cards. That's it for family. Teachers, coaches, anyone at his school who's shown unusual interest." Will thought about Max's first-grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been teaching for 20 years and treated every child like her own grandchild. About the school principal, who knew every student's name and handed out stickers for good behavior. Cedar Falls Elementary wasn't the kind of place where predators lurked in hallways. "No one," he said. Everyone who knows Max loves him, but not in any way that would... He couldn't finish the sentence. Chen's questions continued. Max's medical history. Any family history of mental illness or violence. Details about Sarah's death and how Will had coped with becoming a single parent. Each answer felt like a small betrayal, as if providing information for the investigation somehow suggested he was complicit in his son's disappearance. By dawn, Will had been fingerprinted, photographed, and subjected to what Chen carefully didn't call a polygraph examination. The FBI agent, a woman named Torres, who looked like she'd seen too many cases like this, explained that it was standard procedure, a way to eliminate Will as a suspect so they could focus on finding the real perpetrator. The results are inconclusive, Torres told him afterward. That's not unusual given your emotional state. Grief and fear can affect the readings. Inconclusive. Will understood what that meant in practical terms. He was still a suspect. The father who'd lost track of his son, who had financial problems and no family support, who fit the profile of someone who might crack under pressure. When they finally released him to go home, Will found his house transformed. News vans lined Maple Street. Reporters with microphones lurked near his front door. Neighbors clustered in small groups, their conversations stopping when they noticed him approaching. Harold Brennan was waiting on Will's front porch, holding a thermos and wearing the patient expression of someone who'd been there for hours. "Thought you might need coffee," Harold said simply. "And maybe someone to help with the reporters." Will accepted both offerings gratefully. Harold walked him to the front door, positioning himself between Will and the cameras with the subtle protectiveness of a much larger man. Inside, the house felt simultaneously too quiet and too full of Max's presence. His drawings covered the refrigerator. His toys occupied their designated corner of the living room. His Batman backpack hung by the door, ready for school. "The police will find him," Harold said, settling into Will's kitchen chair as if he belonged there. Cedar Falls is a small town. There aren't many places a child could be hidden. Will wanted to believe that, but 12 hours was a long time in the life of a missing 6-year-old. Long enough for someone to drive hundreds of miles. Long enough for unthinkable things to happen in basements or abandoned buildings, or places that wouldn't show up on any search grid. "I keep thinking I missed something," Will said. Some sign that he was scared or that someone had approached him. What kind of father doesn't notice when his child is in danger? Harold poured coffee from his thermos into 2 mugs that Max had picked. Out at a church craft fair, ceramic pieces painted, with wonky rainbows and the words "World's Best Dad" in 6-year-old handwriting. "The kind who trusts that the world is basically safe," Harold said. "The kind who believes that bad things happen to other people's children." There was something in Harold's voice, a weight that suggested personal experience with loss. Will remembered the comment about having had a little boy once and wondered what tragedy had brought Harold to Cedar Falls, to this house behind theirs, to this life of careful solitude. The phone rang constantly, friends from work offering to help with the search. Parents from Max's school expressing sympathy and shock. Reporters trying to get interviews. Will let the machine pick up most calls, but when Mrs. Chen phoned to say she was organizing a neighborhood canvass, he grabbed the receiver. "Detective Chen says they've checked all the obvious places," Mrs. Chen reported. "Now they're expanding to a 5-mile radius. Abandoned buildings, construction sites, anywhere a child might be held. Held, not hiding, not lost. Held." The word hung in the air like a blade. Over the next 3 days, Will's life became a strange routine of police interviews, search coordination, and media management. Chief Morrison had assigned an officer to handle the press, but reporters still found ways to approach Will directly. They wanted to know about his relationship with Max, his financial situation, his dead wife. They asked leading questions about single fathers and stress, and whether he'd ever felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child alone. The searches grew more systematic and more desperate. Volunteers divided into grid patterns, checking every barn, shed, and outbuilding within a 10-mile radius of Cedar Falls. Divers searched the creek that ran through the center of town. Dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere or everywhere, confounded by the number of people who'd been looking for Max. Harold appeared each morning with coffee and quiet company. He helped field phone calls, organized the casseroles that well-meaning neighbors kept bringing, and served as a buffer between Will and the increasingly aggressive media attention. His presence was both comforting and puzzling. He seemed to have no life outside of helping with the search, no obligations that required his attention elsewhere. "Don't you have work?" Will asked on the fourth day, when Harold had spent another full day coordinating volunteers from Will's kitchen table. "Retired, remember?" Harold smiled. "And this is more important than anything else I might be doing." Will was grateful for the help, but questions were beginning to surface. Detective Chen had asked about Harold during their second interview, wondering how well Will actually knew his neighbor. Did he know where Harold had lived before Cedar Falls? What had happened to the son he'd mentioned? Why had a man with no local connections chosen such a small, isolated town for his retirement? Will realized he didn't know any of those answers. In 4 years of neighborly interaction, Harold had shared very little about his past, his family, or his reasons for moving to Cedar Falls. He'd been helpful and kind, but also carefully private, a man who deflected personal questions with gentle skill, but those concerns felt petty in the face of Max's disappearance. Harold was helping when others were whispering. He was present when others were keeping their distance. Whatever secrets he might have were his own business, and Will was in no position to judge anyone for wanting privacy. By the end of the first week, the official search had expanded to 3 counties. Max's picture appeared on milk cartons and highway billboards. The FBI had interviewed every registered sex offender within a 100-mile radius. Tips poured in from across the country, sightings in grocery stores and gas stations, reports of children who looked like Max in cities from Boston to Seattle. None of them led anywhere. Will's savings account drained as he took unpaid leave from both jobs to focus on the search. The bills piled up on his kitchen counter, but paying them seemed less important than checking every lead, following every tip, and maintaining the hope. That was becoming harder to sustain with each passing day. It was Harold who suggested the media appeal, a televised plea for information that might reach someone who'd seen something important. Will hated the idea of putting his grief on public display, but if it might help find Max, he'd do anything. The press conference was scheduled for Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Max had disappeared. Will spent Sunday night practicing what he would say, trying to find words that might reach whoever had taken his son. Harold helped him choose clothes that would look trustworthy on camera and offered to drive him to the police station where the media had gathered. "Just speak from your heart," Harold advised as they pulled into the parking lot crowded with news vans. "Anyone who sees how much you love that boy will want to help bring him home." Will nodded, though his heart felt too broken to trust with something this important. In 7 days, his son had become a missing person, a case number, a photograph on a poster. But to Will, Max was still the boy who negotiated for extra bedtime stories and drew crooked rainbows on coffee mugs. As he walked toward the cameras, Will carried that image with him. Max's grin, Max's excitement about snow, Max's absolute trust that his father would always keep him safe. It was the one promise Will had failed to keep. The bedtime book lay open on Max's pillow, exactly where Will had left it the night before his son disappeared. The Brave Little Bear was Max's favorite, a story about a young bear who gets lost in the forest but finds his way home through courage and clever thinking. They'd been halfway through chapter 3 when Max's eyes had grown heavy, and Will had promised to finish it the next night. 4 weeks later, the book remained open to page 47, its colorful illustrations gathering dust in the winter light that streamed through Max's bedroom window. Will couldn't bring himself to close it. Closing the book felt like giving up, like accepting that there might not be a next bedtime story. The media attention had been both blessing and curse. The press conference had generated hundreds of tips, but most led nowhere. Mistaken identities, attention seekers, well-meaning people who'd convinced themselves they'd seen something significant. Detective Chen and her team followed every lead with professional thoroughness, but Will could see the growing frustration in their faces during the daily briefings. "We're expanding the search to include all of Oregon and southern Washington," Chief Morrison explained during a meeting in the police station's conference room. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins that represented searches completed, tips investigated, and areas still to be covered. The FBI has issued an Amber Alert update with enhanced distribution. Will studied the maps, trying to imagine his son somewhere in that vast network of highways and small towns. Max had never been more than 50 miles from Cedar Falls in his entire life. The world beyond their small town would seem enormous to a 6-year-old, terrifying in its unfamiliarity. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. Will's boss at Henderson's Hardware had been patient for the first 2 weeks, but the store couldn't hold his position indefinitely. Murphy's Diner had been more understanding. Eleanor Murphy had lost a child herself years ago, a baby to SIDS, and she knew the particular agony of empty arms and unanswered prayers. "Take whatever time you need," she'd told Will. "The job will be here when you're ready." But ready for what? Ready to pretend that life could return to normal while his son remained missing. Ready to serve coffee and smile at customers while Max might be hungry or scared or worse, somewhere beyond reach. The community fundraiser had helped temporarily. Mrs. Chen had organized a spaghetti dinner at the church that raised nearly $3,000 for search expenses and Will's living costs. The generosity overwhelmed him. Neighbors who barely knew him, contributing what they could, local businesses donating services, children from Max's class bringing piggy bank savings to help find their classmate. But generosity couldn't solve the underlying problem. Without income, Will would lose the house within 2 months. Losing the house meant losing the place Max knew as home. The bedroom with its drawings on the walls, the kitchen where they'd shared countless meals, the backyard where Max had built snow forts and hidden treasures. "You could stay with me temporarily," Harold offered one evening as they sat in Will's kitchen, surrounded by maps and missing person flyers. "I have plenty of space, and it would save money for the search efforts." Will considered the offer. Harold's house was larger than theirs, a 2-story colonial with more bedrooms than one retired man could possibly need. The gesture was generous, but something about it felt wrong, as if accepting would mean admitting that Max wasn't coming home to his own bed. "I appreciate it," Will said carefully. "But I need to stay here, in case he comes back, in case he remembers his address but not yours." Harold nodded understanding, but Will caught something in his expression. Disappointment maybe, or frustration. It passed, quickly replaced by Harold's usual gentle concern. "Of course. I just hate seeing you struggle with everything alone." Harold's presence had become both comfort and complication. He continued appearing each morning with coffee and newspapers, staying through the day to help coordinate search efforts or field phone calls. His dedication was remarkable, but it also raised questions that Will tried not to examine too closely. What did Harold do when he wasn't at Will's house? Where had he lived before Cedar Falls? Why had a man with no apparent connections to the town chosen such an isolated place for retirement? And why did he seem to have no life outside of helping with Max's case? Detective Chen had asked similar questions during their most recent interview. She'd been discreet about it, but Will understood that everyone connected to Max was being investigated. That included neighbors, especially neighbors who'd inserted themselves so thoroughly into the family's life. "Tell me about Harold Brennan's relationship with Max," Chen had said. "Did they spend time together? Did Max ever mention going to Harold's house?" Will had tried to remember specific interactions between Harold and Max. There had been the wooden toy car Harold had carved, birthday presents that appeared on their porch, conversations over the back fence about Max's school projects. But nothing that seemed inappropriate or concerning. "Harold's been kind to us," Will had said. "I think he misses having family around." Chen had made notes without comment, but Will sensed there was more to her questions than routine investigation. Later, when he'd asked directly if Harold was a suspect, Chen had given him the careful non-answer. the police officers used when they couldn't share information. We're looking at everyone who had contact with Max. That's standard procedure. The psychological evaluation had been Dr. Martinez's idea. Will hadn't wanted to see a counselor. Grief counseling felt like preparation for accepting Max's death, and he wasn't ready for that conversation. But the sleepless nights were affecting his ability to think clearly, and the stress was manifesting in physical ways that scared him. "You're showing signs of severe trauma," Dr. Martinez had explained after their second session. "Insomnia, anxiety, inability to concentrate. These are normal responses to an abnormal situation, but they're also preventing you from being as effective in the search as you could be." The sleeping pills helped, but they also made Will feel disconnected from the search efforts. How could he sleep soundly when Max might be calling for him somewhere? How could he take medication that dulled his senses when his son needed him to be sharp, alert, ready for any clue that might lead to rescue? It was during one of those medicated sleeps that Will had the dream. He was walking through a maze of underground tunnels, calling Max's name and hearing only echoes in response. The tunnels seemed to stretch forever, branching and reconnecting in patterns that made no sense. Sometimes he could hear Max's voice answering from somewhere far away, but every time he thought he was getting closer, the voice would fade. He'd woken from that dream with absolute certainty that Max was underground somewhere. Not dead. Will refused to consider that possibility, but hidden in a basement or root cellar or some other space below ground level. The feeling was so strong that he'd called Detective Chen at 6 in the morning to suggest they expand the search to include underground spaces. "We've checked every basement in town," Chen had assured him. "Storm drains, utility tunnels, even old mine shafts in the surrounding area. If Max is being held underground, it's not anywhere we haven't already looked." But the dream persisted, returning night after night with variations. Sometimes Max was crying in the darkness. Sometimes he was singing the songs they'd shared during bedtime routines. Once, terrifyingly, Max had been silent, and Will had searched the tunnels without hearing any response to his calls. Dr. Martinez suggested the dreams reflected Will's fear of losing control, his need to believe that Max was somewhere findable rather than gone forever. She recommended keeping a dream journal, as if writing down the nightmares might rob them of their power to disturb his sleep. Will tried it for a week before giving up. The dreams weren't random anxiety. They felt like messages, like his subconscious was trying to tell him something important about where to search for his son. Maybe that was denial or desperation, but it was all he had to hold on to. The 6th week brought the first break in the case, though it wasn't the kind of break Will had been hoping for. A registered sex offender named Marcus Webb had been arrested in Portland for an unrelated crime, and during questioning, he'd made comments about knowing where that missing kid from Cedar Falls ended up. The interview had lasted 8 hours. Webb described details about Max's appearance and clothing that hadn't been released to the public, suggesting he'd either seen Max or had access to someone who had. But when pressed for specifics about Max's location, Webb's story fell apart. He claimed Max had been sold to people in California, then changed his story to say the boy had been taken to Canada. Finally, he admitted he'd made everything up to try to negotiate a plea deal on his other charges. "It happens more than you'd think," Detective Chen explained to Will after Webb's confession. "People see the media coverage and think they can use it to their advantage. It's cruel, but it's also unfortunately common." Will had allowed himself to hope for 12 hours that the nightmare might be ending. The disappointment was crushing, leaving him more exhausted than he'd been since the first night Max disappeared. Harold found him that evening sitting in Max's bedroom, holding the bedtime book and trying to remember exactly how his son's voice sounded when he laughed. "Bad day?" Harold asked from the doorway. Will nodded, not trusting his voice. Harold sat on the edge of Max's bed, his presence both comforting and strange in the space that belonged so completely to the missing child. "I keep thinking I should remember something," Will said finally. "Some detail from that day at the park, some person who was watching Max or acting suspicious." But I played it over 1,000 times in my head, and there's nothing—" Harold was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Will had never heard before. "Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem completely safe," Harold said. "The ones who know exactly how to blend in, how to be helpful and trustworthy right up until the moment they're not." Will looked at his neighbor, this man who'd become so central to his life during the worst period he'd ever experienced. Harold's pale blue eyes were fixed on the bedtime book, but his expression seemed distant, as if he were remembering something painful. "You sound like you speak from experience," Will said. Harold's smile was sad and complicated. "I've learned that the world is full of people who aren't what they seem to be, present company included." Before Will could ask what he meant by that, Harold stood and moved toward the door. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will bring what it brings, but you need to be strong for whatever comes." Will watched his neighbor disappear down the hallway, wondering what secrets lay behind Harold's careful kindness. But exhaustion was stronger than curiosity, and within minutes he was asleep in Max's bed, the bedtime book still open in his hands. In his dreams, he was underground again, searching tunnels that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere. But this time he wasn't alone. Someone else was in the maze with him. Someone who knew exactly where Max was hidden, but wouldn't tell him how to find the way. Harold's garden journal sat open on his kitchen table, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting that documented 3 years of planting seasons, harvest yields, and weather patterns. Will discovered it by accident when Harold had stepped outside to move his sprinkler, leaving Will alone in the house they'd been using as search coordination headquarters. The journal itself seemed innocent enough. Notes about soil pH, frost dates, and which vegetables grew best in Cedar Falls climate. But something about Harold's obsessive record-keeping struck Will as odd for a man who grew tomatoes and lettuce in quantities far too large for one person to consume. March 15th. Soil preparation complete. Foundation work proceeds as planned. Will flipped through earlier pages, noting entries that seemed to have little to do with gardening. January 8th. Subject exhibits predictable patterns. School pickup at 3:15, park visits Tuesday and Friday afternoons. February 3rd, target demonstrates high trust levels. Intervention window identified. Will's hands began shaking as he read. These weren't gardening notes, they were surveillance records. But surveillance of what, of whom? Planning complete, read an entry dated 2 weeks before Max's disappearance. Implementation phase begins with next suitable weather event. Harold's footsteps on the back porch sent Will scrambling to close the journal and return it to its original position. By the time Harold entered the kitchen, Will was studying search maps with what he hoped looked like focused concentration. "Any new developments while I was outside?" Harold asked, settling into his usual chair as if nothing had happened. Will managed to shake his head, though his mind was racing. The journal entries could be interpreted innocently. Maybe Harold kept detailed records of everything, including neighborhood routines he'd observed while working in his garden. But the language felt deliberate, clinical, like reports written by someone conducting an investigation. "I should head home," Will said, gathering the maps that no longer seemed important compared to what he'd just discovered. "Thanks for letting me use your kitchen table." Harold walked him to the door with his usual quiet courtesy, but Will felt those pale blue eyes watching him more intently than usual. At the property line between their yards, Harold touched Will's arm. "You know you can trust me, don't you?" Harold said. "Whatever happens, whatever you discover, I'm on your side." The words should have been comforting, but they felt like a warning. Will nodded and escaped to his own house, where he immediately called Detective Chen. "I need to report something," he said when she answered. "It's about my neighbor." Chen arrived within an hour, bringing backup that suggested she'd taken Will's call seriously. She listened carefully as Will described the journal entries, taking notes and asking specific questions about Harold's behavior over the past 2 months. "Has he ever asked detailed questions about Max's routine?" Chen asked. Will thought back through dozens of conversations. He knew Max's school schedule, which park we like to visit, He seemed to know things about our family that I didn't remember telling him. What about access to your house? Has he ever been inside when you weren't there? He has a spare key, Will admitted. I gave it to him last month when my work schedule got complicated. In case of emergencies, Chen made more notes. We'll need that key back, and we'll need to search his property. The search warrant came through the next morning. Will watched from his kitchen window as police cars surrounded Harold's house, officers emerging with equipment that suggested they expected to find more than gardening. Supplies. Harold answered his door with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the search for Max. He spoke quietly with Detective Chen, handed over keys without argument, and stood aside while officers filed into his house. The search took 6 hours. Will couldn't concentrate on anything else, pacing his kitchen and watching through windows as investigators carried out boxes of documents, bags of evidence, and Harold's computer equipment. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering about developments none of them had seen coming. Mrs. Chen appeared at Will's door with coffee and worried questions. "I can't believe Harold might be involved," she said, settling at his kitchen table, where Harold had sat dozens of times over the past 2 months. He seemed so genuine, so concerned about finding Max. That was exactly what bothered Will. Harold's concern had seemed genuine. The early morning coffee, the help with reporters, the emotional support during the darkest days of the search. If Harold was involved in Max's disappearance, then every moment of comfort he'd provided had been manipulation. Detective Chen knocked on Will's door as the search was concluding. Her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about what they'd discovered. "We found some items that require further investigation," she said. "Harold's computer contained files we need to analyze, and there were some photographs that concern us." "Photographs of what?" "Children, including several of Max taken from a distance over the past several months." Will's legs went weak. He'd trusted Harold completely, relied on him for emotional support, even considered his offer to let Will and Max stay in his house temporarily. The thought of what might have happened if he'd accepted that offer made him physically sick. Is he under arrest? Not yet. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. We need more before we can file charges. Harold was released that evening with instructions not to leave town. Will watched him return to his house as if nothing had happened, turning on lights and resuming whatever routine he followed when he wasn't inserting himself into Will's life. The next few days were torture. Harold continued his morning appearances with coffee and newspapers, acting as if the search of his property had been a minor inconvenience rather than a major development in a kidnapping investigation. He offered explanations for everything. The photographs were innocent documentation of neighborhood children playing, taken because he missed having young people around. The journal entries were misunderstood abbreviations for legitimate gardening activities. "I understand why you're suspicious," Harold told Will during one of these encounters. "But you know me. You know I would never hurt Max or any child." But Will was beginning to realize he didn't know Harold at all. In 4 years of neighborly interaction, Harold had shared almost nothing substantive about his past, his family, or his reasons for moving to Cedar Falls. He'd been helpful and present, but also carefully anonymous, a man who deflected personal questions with practiced skill. Detective Chen's investigation into Harold's background revealed disturbing gaps. His previous address in Spokane couldn't be verified. The landlord remembered a quiet tenant who'd paid cash and kept to himself, but had no forwarding information when Harold left. His employment history with the Postal Service checked out, but former co-workers described him as isolated and strange, someone who knew everyone's personal business but shared nothing about his own life. Most troubling was the discovery that Harold's wife hadn't died in an accident, as he'd claimed. Ellen Brennan had been found dead in their basement, officially ruled a fall down the stairs, but the responding officers had noted suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. She had injuries consistent with a struggle, Chen explained during a briefing at the police station. Defensive wounds on her hands, bruising that suggested she'd been grabbed forcefully. But Harold's story was consistent. There were no witnesses. and the physical evidence could support either conclusion. Will thought about Harold's basement, which he'd never seen, despite spending so much time in the house. Harold had always steered their meetings to the kitchen or living room, mentioning vaguely that the basement was unfinished and used only for storage. "Can you search the basement specifically?" Will asked. "We did. It's been recently renovated. New concrete floor, fresh paint on the walls. If there was evidence of anything happening down there, it's been thoroughly concealed." The renovation bothered Will more than he could articulate. Why would a man living alone invest in finishing a basement he claimed to use only for storage? When had the work been done? And why hadn't Harold mentioned such a major project during their countless conversations about home maintenance? Will began his own surveillance, watching Harold's house from his upstairs window during the evening hours when his neighbor thought no one was paying attention. Harold kept regular schedules, lights on at specific times, movements through the house that followed predictable patterns. But occasionally, Will noticed something odd. Harold would disappear into his basement for hours at a time, sometimes not emerging until well after midnight. The basement windows were painted black from the inside, making it impossible to see what he was doing down there. Once Will thought he heard sounds coming from that direction, not construction noise, but something that might have been muffled voices or crying. The sounds could have been anything: television, radio, pipes settling in an old house. But they came at strange hours and seemed to follow patterns that suggested intentional activity rather than random noise. 3 weeks after the search, Harold's behavior began to change. He still appeared with morning coffee, but his conversation became more pointed, more personal. He asked about Will's mental state, his relationship with the police, his plans for the future. "You can't keep living in limbo forever," Harold said one morning. "At some point, you have to accept that Max might not be coming home." The comment felt cruel, but Harold delivered it with the same gentle concern he'd shown throughout the crisis. It was as if he was trying to guide Will toward acceptance, toward giving up the search that was consuming his life and resources. "I'll never stop looking for my son," Will replied. Harold nodded sadly. "Of course. But you also have to think about taking care of yourself. Max wouldn't want you to destroy your life trying to find him." Later, Will would remember that conversation as the moment he became certain Harold knew exactly where Max was. The way Harold spoke about Max in past tense, the subtle pressure to abandon the search, the assumption that continuing to look was pointless, it all suggested knowledge rather than speculation. That night, Will made a decision that would have horrified Detective Chen if she'd known about it. He was going to search Harold's basement himself, regardless of the legal consequences. If Max was being held somewhere, if there was any chance his son was still alive and reachable, Will couldn't wait for warrants and official procedures, but he would need to be smart about it. Harold's house had security cameras that hadn't been there 6 months ago. The basement entry was visible from multiple neighbors' windows, and Harold himself seemed to be watching Will as carefully as Will was watching him. As Will planned his unauthorized investigation, one thought kept returning. Harold had been the first neighbor to appear at the park when Max went missing. He joined search parties, offered comfort, positioned himself as an ally in the effort to find the missing child. The most dangerous people, Harold had said, are the ones who seem completely safe. Will was beginning to understand that Harold had been describing himself. The hand-drawn map Will discovered in Harold's mailbox wasn't meant for him to find. It had been folded and wedged behind the metal flag, probably forgotten during one of Harold's careful document purges. But when Will noticed the edge of paper protruding during his evening walk past Harold's property, curiosity overtook caution. The map showed an intricate network of underground passages connecting several properties in their neighborhood. Harold's house sat at the center, with tunnels extending toward the creek, the old Methodist church, and, most troubling, the foundation of Will's own home. The drawing was detailed and professional, marked with measurements, elevation changes, and structural notations that suggested extensive planning. Will studied the map by flashlight in his backyard, his hands shaking as he traced the lines that represented months or years of secret excavation. The tunnel system explained so much, how someone could move unseen through the neighborhood, how a child could be taken from a busy park without witnesses, how Harold could maintain surveillance of multiple families while appearing to live a normal, isolated life. One section of the map was marked with particular care. A chamber beneath Harold's basement labeled simply storage, with access points that bypassed the main house entirely. The chamber appeared to be soundproofed and climate-controlled, designed for long-term occupancy. Will's phone call to Detective Chen went straight to voicemail. Her shift had ended hours ago, and the duty officer who answered the main police number seemed skeptical of Will's claims about underground tunnels and secret maps. "Sir, we've already searched Mr. Brennan's property thoroughly," the officer said. "If you've found evidence of criminal activity, you should bring it to the station tomorrow morning when Detective Chen is available. But tomorrow morning might be too late. If Harold discovered the map was missing, he might move Max or destroy evidence or disappear entirely." Will had been patient with official procedures for 2 months, watching his son's case grow cold while bureaucracy moved at its careful pace. Rex, the golden retriever who'd become Will's closest companion during the long nights of searching, had been acting strange for weeks. The dog would stand at the back fence separating their yard from Harold's, whining and pawing at the ground as if he could smell something significant below the surface. Will had attributed the behavior to stress. Even dogs could sense when their families were in crisis. Now he wondered if Rex had been trying to tell him something important. "What is it, boy?" Will whispered, joining the dog at the fence line. Rex immediately began digging at a spot where the chain link had been recently repaired, his claws scraping against what sounded like hollow ground. Will knelt beside the dog, pressing his ear to the earth. Far below, almost inaudible, he thought he heard something that made his heart stop, the faint sound of someone moving around, maybe even the distant echo of a voice. The sound could have been anything: water pipes, settling foundations, his own desperate imagination creating audio mirages. But Rex was focused on this exact spot, with the intensity of a hunting dog on a scent trail. Animals knew things humans missed, detected sounds and smells that existed below the threshold of human perception. Will's decision to investigate on his own felt both inevitable and terrifying. He couldn't wait for official permission while his son might be suffering just yards away from their house. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that Harold was watching, waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. The solution came from an unexpected source: Mrs. Chen, who appeared at Will's back door with a casserole and worried questions about Harold's recent behavior. "He's been asking strange things," she said, settling at Will's kitchen table. "About your work schedule, about whether you've been sleeping well, about your plans for Max's bedroom." "What kind of questions about Max's bedroom?" "Whether you'd considered turning it into something else. A home office maybe, or guest room. He seemed very interested in when you might be ready to pack up Max's belongings." The conversation felt predatory, as if Harold was gauging Will's readiness to give up hope. Most parents of missing children eventually reached a point where maintaining their child's room became too painful, where accepting loss seemed healthier than clinging to increasingly unlikely possibilities of return. Harold was trying to determine if Will had reached that point, and if not, how to push him there. "There's something else," Mrs. Chen continued. "Harold's been in my yard when he thinks I'm not home. I saw him from my upstairs window, measuring something near the property line between our houses." Will showed her the map he'd found, watching her face pale as she traced the tunnel networks that violated every property in their quiet neighborhood. "This is why the police couldn't find Max," she said. "They were searching above ground while he was being held underground. Together, they developed a plan that balanced urgency with safety. Mrs. Chen would call Detective Chen's supervisor to report the new evidence, emphasizing the immediate danger to Max if Harold decided to relocate him. Meanwhile, Will would begin carefully excavating the area where Rex had been digging, looking for evidence of the tunnel entrance marked on Harold's map. The work had to be done in darkness, when Harold's lights were off and his movements inside the house suggested sleep. Will used garden tools to avoid the noise of power equipment, digging carefully to avoid damaging any structure he might find below ground level. 3 feet down, his shovel hit something that wasn't earth or rock. Wood, maybe, or concrete. Something artificial that had been carefully concealed beneath a layer of soil and grass. Rex became increasingly excited as Will exposed more of the hidden surface, whining and scratching as if he could sense familiar scents emerging from below. The concealed structure turned out to be a wooden trap door, weathered but sturdy, with hinges that had been recently oiled to operate silently. Will lifted it carefully, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness deeper than his flashlight could penetrate. The smell that emerged from the opening was distinctly human, not decay, thankfully, but the unmistakable odor of occupied space that had been closed off from fresh air circulation. Someone had been living down there, breathing that stale air, existing in the darkness beneath Harold's carefully maintained yard. Will's phone vibrated with a text message from Detective Chen. Got Mrs. Chen's call. Backup en route. Do not enter tunnel alone. Wait for support. But waiting meant risking Harold's discovery of the excavation. If Harold realized his secret entrance had been found, he might harm Max or move him to another location. Will had spent 2 months following official procedures while his son remained missing. He couldn't wait any longer. The ladder was sturdy, designed for regular use by someone who needed reliable access to whatever lay below. Will descended carefully, his flashlight beam revealing a hand-dug passage that extended in the direction of Harold's house. The tunnel was tall enough for an adult to walk upright, wide enough for 2 people to pass, and lined with wooden supports that suggested professional construction skills. 20 feet from the ladder, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that took Will's breath away. The space was furnished like a studio apartment, sleeping area, small kitchen setup, even a television and bookshelves. But the furnishings were scaled for a child, and the walls were decorated with drawings that Will recognized immediately. Max's artwork covered every available surface. Crayon pictures of their house, their family, their dog Rex. Drawings Will had never seen before, depicting the underground room with surprising accuracy and detail. In one corner, a pile of familiar clothes, Max's blue snowsuit, his favorite sweater, the red mittens that matched the one left behind at the park. Max was alive. The realization hit Will with physical force, dropping him to his knees in the middle of his son's secret prison. For 2 months, while Will had searched frantically across 3 counties, Max had been living in this underground chamber just 30 yards from their house. But the chamber was empty now. Max's belongings remained, but the boy himself was nowhere to be found. Fresh food in the small refrigerator suggested recent occupancy, but the bed was made, and the space had the stillness of temporary abandonment. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance, too light and quick to belong to Detective Chen or the backup officers who should have been arriving. Will killed his flashlight and pressed himself against the chamber wall, listening as someone descended the ladder with practiced familiarity. Harold's voice carried clearly in the enclosed space, speaking to someone Will couldn't see. "I told you we might have to move tonight," Harold was saying. "The father's getting too close, asking too many questions." A smaller voice responded, Max's voice, unmistakably, though changed by months of fear and isolation. "I want to go home now. You said I could go home when winter was over. Plans change, buddy. We're going to take a little trip, see some new places. Won't that be exciting?" Will's hands clenched into fists as he listened to Harold's gentle manipulation of his terrified son. The same tone Harold had used to comfort Will during the search. The same patient kindness that had masked months of deliberate cruelty. The sound of movement suggested Harold was gathering items from the chamber, preparing to relocate Max to another hiding place. Will understood that this was his only chance. Once Harold moved his son away from the neighborhood, The search would start over with no guarantees of another breakthrough. As Harold's flashlight beam swept across the chamber, Will stepped out of the shadows and spoke his son's name. Max. "Daddy's here, buddy. Daddy's here." The cassette recorder had been hidden beneath Max's makeshift bed in the underground chamber. Tucked away like a shameful secret Harold hadn't wanted his young prisoner to find. When Detective Chen's team processed the crime scene 12 hours later, the device would become the most damning piece of evidence in a case that had already shattered everything Will thought. He knew about trust and safety, but in the moment, when Will called his son's name and stepped into Harold's flashlight beam, all he could see was Max, alive, breathing, real after 2 months of nightmares and desperate searching. The boy looked smaller than Will remembered, thinner, with the pale complexion of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in too long. But he was moving, responding, scrambling toward his father with the kind of desperate recognition that confirmed Will's worst fears about what had been done to his child. "Daddy!" Max's voice cracked with emotion and disuse, as if he'd been afraid to speak too loudly for months. He threw himself into Will's arms with the force of a child who'd believed he might never see his parent again. Harold stood frozen in the tunnel entrance, his own flashlight wavering as if he couldn't decide whether to run or try to explain. In the artificial light of the underground chamber, his familiar face looked different, older somehow, and marked with an expression Will had never seen before. Not the gentle concern Harold had worn throughout the search, but something calculating and cold. "Will," Harold said finally, his voice carrying the same calm tone he'd used during countless morning coffee conversations. "You shouldn't be down here. This isn't what it looks like." Will held Max tighter, feeling his son's heart beating against his chest like a terrified bird. The boy was alive and breathing and safe in his arms, but Will could feel him shaking, not just from excitement at the reunion, but from months of fear that had become part of his physical response to everything. "What it looks like," Will said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded, "is that you kidnapped my son and kept him prisoner in your basement for 2 months. Harold's expression shifted subtly, as if he were recalibrating his approach to match this new development. The mask of concerned neighbor was slipping, revealing something underneath that Will recognized with sick certainty. This was Harold's real face, the one he'd been hiding behind 2 months of coffee and casseroles and emotional support. "Max needed protection," Harold said, moving closer, but staying far enough away that Will could escape up the ladder if necessary. His father was becoming unstable, dangerous. The drinking, the financial pressure, the inability to cope with single parenthood. Someone had to intervene. "I don't drink," Will said, "and I was never dangerous to my son." Harold smiled, and the expression was worse than anger would have been, patient and condescending, like an adult explaining obvious truths to a confused child. "The pills, then. The sleeping medication Dr. Martinez prescribed. Do you know what happens to children when their parents are drugged unconscious every night? When their cries for help go unanswered because daddy is too medicated to wake up?" Will felt the world tilting around him. The sleeping pills had been prescribed after Max's disappearance, not before. Harold was rewriting history, creating a narrative that justified his actions by painting Will as an unfit parent who'd needed to have his son removed for safety reasons. "You took him before I started taking anything," Will said. "You planned this. The journal entries, the surveillance, the tunnel system. You were planning to take Max long before you had any excuse about my mental state." "Plans evolve," Harold replied, "but the core issue remains the same. Max deserves better than what you were providing. Look at him. When's the last time you saw him this calm and content?" Will looked down at his son, who was indeed calm, but in the way that traumatized children learn to be. Too still, too quiet, too careful about making noise or drawing attention. This wasn't contentment. It was learned survival behavior. "What did you do to him?" Will asked. Harold's expression became defensive, almost hurt. "I cared for him. Fed him, educated him, provided structure and safety." More than he was getting in that house where his father was too busy working or sleeping or feeling sorry for himself to pay proper attention. You kidnapped him. You made him live underground like an animal. I gave him consistency, Harold snapped, the first crack in his calm facade. I gave him bedtime stories and proper meals and someone who was present for him instead of constantly distracted by work and bills and grief over a dead woman who wasn't coming back. The casual cruelty of the comment about Sarah revealed more about Harold's psychology than hours of interrogation might have. This wasn't a man who'd acted impulsively or been driven by desperation. This was someone who'd carefully studied Will's family, identified weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and constructed an elaborate plan to exploit them. Max spoke for the first time since calling for his father, his voice small and uncertain in the underground chamber. He said you didn't want me anymore, Max whispered. He played a recording of your voice saying I was too much trouble and you wished I would go away. Will's vision went red around the edges. The cassette recorder Harold had used to manipulate a 6-year-old child, playing fabricated messages designed to make Max believe his father had abandoned him. The psychological torture was worse than any physical abuse, because it had attacked the one thing that should have been unshakable, a child's faith in his parents' love. That wasn't my voice, buddy, Will said, though he could imagine how convincing Harold's recordings might have been to a scared, isolated child. I never said those things. I've been looking for you every single day since you disappeared. Harold stepped closer, and Will noticed for the first time that his neighbor was carrying a bag, not the casual tote he used for groceries, but a purposeful pack that suggested travel preparations. We were leaving tonight, Harold said, starting fresh somewhere new, where Max could have the stability he deserves. You forced my hand by coming down here. Where were you planning to take him? Does it matter? Somewhere far from the chaos you call parenting. Somewhere Max could grow up without watching his father fall apart from stress and grief and inadequacy. Will understood that Harold genuinely believed his own rationalization. In his mind, he'd rescued Max from an unfit parent, provided better care than Will could offer, and planned to continue that care indefinitely. The fact that Max was miserable, traumatized, and desperate to go home didn't register as evidence that Harold's approach was wrong. Max, Will said quietly, can you tell me about the voice recordings? The ones Mr. Harold played for you? Max nodded against Will's shoulder. He had lots of them. You saying mean things about me, saying you were glad I was gone? But they sounded wrong, like pieces stuck together, audio editing. Harold had probably recorded Will's voice during their countless conversations, then spliced together words and phrases to create messages that sounded authentic, but conveyed meanings Will had never intended. It was technologically simple, but psychologically devastating, especially to a child who had no reason to doubt what he was hearing. Did he hurt you? Will asked, dreading the answer. Not hitting, Max said carefully. But he got mad when I cried for you. He said crying meant I didn't appreciate what he was doing for me. Harold's face had gone completely cold now, the last pretense of neighborly concern abandoned. He adjusted to the situation. Children are remarkably resilient when they're given proper structure and expectations. Police sirens echoed from somewhere above ground, growing closer with each passing second. Detective Chen had finally arrived with backup, probably responding to Mrs. Chen's call about the map and Will's unauthorized excavation. Harold heard the sirens too, and his posture shifted from defensive to cornered. They won't understand, he said, speaking more to himself than to Will. They'll see this as kidnapping instead of rescue, imprisonment instead of protection, because that's what it was, Will said. Harold shook his head sadly, as if Will were the deluded one. You'll see. When Max starts having nightmares about returning to his old life, when he starts asking to come back here where things were predictable and safe, you'll understand what I was trying to give him. The sirens had stopped, which meant police were probably surrounding Harold's house and discovering the excavation Will had started at the tunnel entrance. Soon this underground nightmare would be flooded with officers and evidence technicians, and all the official procedures that Will had bypassed in his desperation to find his son. But they'd found him. Against all odds, after 2 months of false leads and dead ends, and growing certainty that Max was gone forever, they'd found him alive and reachable and coming home. Harold seemed to realize that his careful plans were collapsing beyond repair. The gentle mask he'd worn for 4 years was completely gone now, replaced by something that Will finally recognized as dangerous. "I could have been a good father to him," Harold said quietly. "I could have given him everything he needed." "You're not his father," Will replied. "You never will be. Neither were you, really. Not in any way that mattered. The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. But they also revealed the core delusion that had driven Harold's actions. He'd convinced himself that he could be a better parent than Will, that his careful control was superior to Will's chaotic but genuine love. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance as Detective Chen and her team began their descent into Harold's underground world. The investigation would take months to complete, revealing the full scope of Harold's surveillance and planning. But the most important discovery had already been made. Max was alive. Max was safe. Max was going home. Everything else was just paperwork. Max's hospital bracelet was small and white, printed with information that reduced 2 months of nightmare to basic medical data. Harlan, Max, age 6, dehydration, malnutrition, psychological evaluation. Will studied it as his son slept in the pediatric ward, finally safe, but marked by an experience that would take years to fully understand. Dr. Sarah Reeves, the child psychologist assigned to Max's case, had spent 3 hours with him that first day, using toys and drawings and gentle questions to assess the psychological damage Harold's care had inflicted. Her preliminary report painted a picture of sophisticated emotional manipulation that went far beyond simple kidnapping. He's been systematically convinced that his normal life was chaotic and dangerous. Dr. Reeves explained during a consultation that Will attended while Max napped. Harold created a false sense of security underground while destroying Max's confidence in the world above. It's going to take time to rebuild his trust in normal family routines. Will nodded, though he was struggling to focus on anything beyond the immediate relief of having Max back. The hospital room felt surreal. After months of searching empty spaces, having his son safely within arm's reach seemed too good to be sustained. Part of him expected to wake up and find this was another dream. Another false hope in a series of psychological tricks his grief-stricken mind was playing on him. The audio recordings were particularly damaging, Dr. Reeves continued. Harold didn't just isolate Max physically, he systematically destroyed his emotional connection to you by playing fabricated messages that suggested you didn't want him back. The recordings had been Harold's masterstroke of cruelty. Detective Chen's technical team had recovered dozens of cassette tapes, each containing carefully edited audio that used Will's own voice to deliver messages he'd never spoken. Harold had recorded their conversations over months, capturing individual words and phrases that could be spliced together to create devastating psychological weapons. "Daddy doesn't miss you," one recording had Max saying. "He's happier without all the trouble you cause." Another featured Will's voice, explaining why Max couldn't come home. "You're too much work. I can't handle taking care of you anymore." To a 6-year-old child isolated underground, hearing his father's voice deliver such messages would have been utterly convincing. Harold had weaponized Will's love for his son, turning it into a tool for psychological torture that left Max believing he'd been abandoned by choice rather than taken by force. The physical evidence recovered from Harold's property painted a picture of obsession that stretched back years. His computer contained thousands of photographs of neighborhood children, surveillance notes documenting their routines, and research into child psychology that had informed his approach to Max's captivity. FBI agent Torres, who'd returned to lead the expanded investigation, briefed Will on discoveries that made his skin crawl. Harold had been planning Max's abduction for over a year, studying the family's routines with scientific precision and constructing the underground chamber specifically to hold a child long-term. The tunnel system extends beyond what we initially discovered, Torres explained during a meeting at the police station. We've found connections to 4 other properties in your neighborhood, including surveillance points that gave him visual access to your backyard and kitchen windows. Will thought about all the times he'd felt watched, all the moments when Harold had appeared with uncanny timing to offer help or conversation. It hadn't been coincidence. Harold had been monitoring their family's activities from multiple vantage points, learning their vulnerabilities and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The community response had been swift and overwhelming. Cedar Falls residents were horrified to learn that a predator had lived among them for years, disguised as a helpful neighbor and concerned citizen. The same people who'd whispered suspicions about Will during the early days of the search now lined up to offer apologies and support. Mrs. Chen had been particularly devastated. I recommended him as a babysitter, she confessed during one of her daily visits to the hospital. Last year, when you were working those double shifts, I suggested Harold might be able to help with Max after school. Thank God you never took me up on it. Will remembered the conversation. Harold had indeed offered to watch Max occasionally, presenting it as neighborly assistance rather than predatory opportunism. Will's financial stress had made the offer tempting, but something had held him back. Instinct maybe, or just the overprotective reflexes of a single parent who'd already lost too much. The legal proceedings were moving faster than anyone had expected. Harold's arrest had been followed by charges that included kidnapping, child endangerment, and psychological abuse. His attorney was already floating an insanity defense, arguing that Harold's delusions about protecting Max from an unfit father demonstrated mental illness rather than criminal. Intent. District Attorney Michael Sharp had met with Will to discuss the prosecution strategy, emphasizing that Harold's careful planning and sophisticated execution argued against any insanity claim. This wasn't the act of someone who'd lost touch with reality, Sharp explained. Harold knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it with deliberate precision over an extended period. The evidence shows premeditation, not mental illness. Will wanted Harold convicted and imprisoned for life, but he also wanted the legal process to move quickly so Max could begin healing without the uncertainty of pending trials. Dr. Reeves had warned that prolonged legal proceedings could be re-traumatizing for child victims, especially when they were required to testify about their experiences. Max's recovery was proceeding in stages that Dr. Reeves had prepared Will to expect. Physical healing came first, proper nutrition, medical care for minor health issues related to his captivity, and adjustment to normal sleep cycles after months of artificial lighting underground. Emotional recovery was more complicated. Max was clingy in ways he hadn't been since Sarah's death, afraid to let Will out of his sight and panicking when he woke up alone. He'd developed habits during captivity, speaking only in whispers, asking permission before eating or using the bathroom, flinching when adults moved too quickly near him. These behaviors kept him safe in Harold's environment, Dr. Reeves explained. It will take time for him to learn that normal childhood behaviors are safe again. The hardest part for Will was seeing how Harold's manipulation had affected Max's perception of their relationship. The boy was clearly happy to be back with his father, but he was also confused about what had been real versus what Harold had convinced him was true. "Did you really look for me?" Max asked one evening as they read together in his hospital bed. "Mr. Harold said you stopped after a few days because you were tired of the trouble." "I looked for you every single day," Will said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped. I never gave up. I love you more than anything in the world, and nothing will ever change that." Max nodded, but Will could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Harold's psychological conditioning would take months or years to fully overcome, leaving scars that might never completely heal. The media attention had been intense, but generally supportive. National news outlets had picked up the story as an example of a father's determination and a community's failure to recognize danger hiding in plain sight. Will had declined most interview requests, but the coverage had generated an outpouring of support from families. Dealing with missing children cases across the country, Chief Morrison had personally apologized for the department's early suspicions about Will's involvement in Max's disappearance. "We should have looked harder at Harold from the beginning," Morrison admitted. "The signs were there. The excessive helpfulness, the insertion into your family's crisis, the way he positioned himself as your primary support system. We missed it." The investigation had revealed that Harold's pattern of behavior wasn't unique to Cedar Falls. FBI background checks had uncovered similar situations in 3 previous towns where Harold had lived, each involving families with young children who'd experienced mysterious disappearances or unexplained behavioral changes. The cases were being reopened, with investigators looking for evidence of Harold's involvement. Will struggled with guilt about those other families. If he'd been more suspicious of Harold earlier, if he'd reported his concerns sooner, other children might have been spared similar ordeals. But Dr. Reeves had been firm about the futility of such thinking. Harold was a sophisticated predator who'd spent years perfecting his approach, she'd said. He knew exactly how to present himself as trustworthy and helpful. You responded the way any reasonable person would to someone offering genuine support during a crisis. The community had rallied around Will and Max in ways that helped restore faith in human decency. A fund, established to help with medical expenses and lost income, had raised more money than Will could have earned in 2 years. Local businesses had donated everything from groceries to toys to professional services that would help Max's recovery. Mrs. Chen had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the support effort, organizing meal deliveries and play dates and whatever else the family needed. Her guilt over having trusted Harold had motivated her to become fiercely protective of Will and Max, as if she could somehow make up for her earlier misjudgment. "You can't blame yourself," Will had told her during one of her more tearful apologies. Harold fooled everyone. That was his skill, making people trust him. Harold's house had been sealed as a crime scene, its contents providing investigators with evidence of planning that stretched back years. They'd found detailed files on dozens of families, surveillance equipment that had been used to monitor neighborhood activities, and construction materials that suggested Harold had been building similar underground chambers in other locations. The tunnel system itself was an engineering marvel that spoke to Harold's patience and determination. Investigators estimated it had taken him 3 years to complete, working mostly at night to avoid detection. The main chamber where Max had been held was just one part of a larger complex that included storage areas, workshop space, and what appeared to be sleeping quarters designed for multiple occupants. Dr. Reeves had warned Will that Max might experience survivor's guilt if he learned about other potential victims. Children often blame themselves for not escaping sooner or for not warning others about danger, she'd explained. It's important that Max understands he was a victim, not someone who could have prevented what happened to him or others. The trial preparation was intensive and emotionally draining. Will spent hours with prosecutors, reviewing evidence and timeline details that would be crucial for conviction. He'd also had to prepare for Harold's defense team, who were likely to attack his parenting and suggest that Max had been better off in Harold's care. "They'll try to paint you as an unfit father who was neglecting his son," D.A. Sharp had warned. Harold's journal entries document every perceived failure in your parenting. Times Max was left with babysitters. Occasions when you seemed stressed or distracted. Financial pressures that affected your family. Will understood the strategy, but it still hurt to have his parenting scrutinized by people who'd never experienced the challenges of single parenthood. Every working parent made compromises between financial necessity and ideal childcare. Every grieving spouse struggled to balance personal healing with their children's needs. "The jury will see through it," Sharp assured him. No parent is perfect, but you loved your son and provided for him. Harold kidnapped him and held him prisoner. There's no moral equivalence between imperfect parenting and child abduction. Max's testimony would be the prosecution's most powerful evidence, but also the most challenging to obtain. Dr. Reeves was working with Max to help him understand what had happened and prepare him to share his experiences in age-appropriate ways. We'll use closed-circuit television so he doesn't have to face Harold directly, Dr. Reeves explained, and we'll have support staff available throughout the process. But ultimately, Max's voice is crucial for showing the jury what Harold actually did to him. Will worried about putting his son through additional trauma for the sake of legal proceedings. Max was already dealing with nightmares, separation anxiety, and confusion about what had been real versus fabricated during his captivity. Adding courtroom testimony seemed like asking too much of a child who'd already endured more than anyone should have to bear, but Dr. Reeves had convinced him that testifying might actually help Max's recovery by giving him agency in the situation where he'd previously been. Powerless children who are able to speak their truth and be believed often heal faster than those who are protected from the legal process, she'd said. Max needs to know that adults will listen to him and take action to keep him safe. The prosecution team had also prepared Will for the possibility that Harold might try to contact him before the trial, either directly or through intermediaries. Imprisoned defendants sometimes attempted to manipulate victims' families, seeking forgiveness or trying to minimize their crimes through emotional appeals. Harold genuinely believes he was helping Max, Agent Torres had warned. That delusion makes him particularly dangerous because he sees himself as a victim of misunderstanding rather than a perpetrator of serious crimes. He may try to convince you that Max was better off in his care. Will had no intention of communicating with Harold under any circumstances, but the warning helped him understand the mindset they were dealing with. Harold wasn't a criminal who knew he'd done wrong. He was a predator who'd rationalized his actions as beneficial to his victim. As Max grew stronger and more confident in the hospital environment, Will began planning for their eventual return to normal life. The house on Maple Street held too many painful associations now, but moving would mean leaving the community that had supported them through the crisis. Dr. Reeves had recommended staying in Cedar Falls if possible, at least until Max completed elementary school. Familiar environments help children feel secure during recovery, she'd explained. Moving to a new town might feel like another form of displacement to someone who's already experienced so much upheaval. Will was considering Mrs. Chen's suggestion that they move into her house temporarily, while he looked for a new place in the same neighborhood. The arrangement would provide Max with continuity while giving them distance from the crime scene that had been Harold's property. "We're family now," Mrs. Chen had said simply, "not by blood, but by choice and experience. Let me help take care of you both while you heal." The offer was generous and practical, but Will was also conscious of the need to rebuild his confidence as Max's primary caregiver. Harold's accusations about his parenting failures had found their mark in Will's own insecurities about single parenthood. Dr. Reeves had addressed this concern directly. "Harold targeted your vulnerabilities because that's what predators do," she'd said. "They find people who are already struggling and exploit those struggles for their own purposes. Your love for Max and your determination to find him prove that you're exactly the parent he needs." As the trial date approached, Will felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Justice for Harold was important, but the legal process also meant reliving the worst period of their lives in public forums where every detail would be scrutinized and debated. Max seemed to sense his father's anxiety about the upcoming proceedings. "Will the judge make Mr. Harold say sorry?" he'd asked during one of their conversations about the trial. "The judge will make sure Mr. Harold can never hurt you or any other children again," Will had replied, focusing on protection rather than punishment in terms a 6-year-old could understand. But privately, Will knew that no courtroom verdict could undo the damage Harold had inflicted. The best they could hope for was justice, closure, and the beginning of a healing process that would take years to complete. The hospital bracelet on Max's wrist was a reminder of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. But it was also proof that they'd survived the worst thing Will could have imagined. And they'd survived it together. That was enough foundation to build on, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The courtroom sketch Max had drawn during his preparation sessions with Dr. Reeves showed remarkable detail for a 6-year-old's artwork. Crayon figures filled the scene. A man behind a wooden table marked "Bad Man," a judge with a black robe and serious expression, and in the corner, a small figure labeled "Me," speaking into what looked like a microphone. The drawing would become Exhibit A47 in the prosecution's case against Harold Brennan, evidence of a child's resilience and determination to help catch his captor. The defendant systematically destroyed this child's sense of safety and security, District Attorney Sharp said during his opening statement, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. For 2 months, Harold Brennan held Max Harlan prisoner in an underground chamber, using sophisticated psychological manipulation to convince a 6-year-old boy that his father had abandoned him. Will sat in the front row, close enough to see Harold's profile, but far enough to avoid direct eye contact. His former neighbor looked smaller in the defendant's chair, older than the man who'd brought coffee and casseroles during the early days of the search. Harold's attorney had dressed him conservatively, gray suit, neutral tie, an appearance designed to suggest harmless confusion rather than predatory calculation. The prosecution's case built methodically through the first day of testimony. Detective Chen walked the jury through the initial investigation, explaining how Harold had inserted himself into the search efforts while concealing his knowledge of Max's location. The defendant attended every volunteer search meeting, Chen testified. He offered suggestions about where to look, provided maps of the local area, and presented himself as someone deeply concerned about finding the missing child. At no point during 2 months of interaction did he reveal that he knew exactly where Max was being held. Agent Torres followed with testimony about Harold's background, describing a pattern of behavior that stretched across multiple states and decades. The FBI had connected Harold to at least 4 other cases involving missing children, though Max's case was the first where they'd recovered sufficient evidence for prosecution. The defendant's computer contained detailed surveillance records of neighborhood families, Torres explained. He had documented the routines of 17 different children, noting their school schedules, playground preferences, and family vulnerabilities. Max Harlan was just one target among many. The technical evidence was damning, but abstract. What hit harder were the personal testimonies from people who'd trusted Harold and been manipulated by his carefully constructed persona. Mrs. Chen took the stand with visible reluctance, her voice shaking as she described recommending Harold as a potential babysitter for Max. He seemed so genuine, she said, looking directly at Will rather than at Harold. He asked thoughtful questions about Max's care, offered to help during school holidays, presented himself as someone who missed having children around. I believed he was exactly what he claimed to be. Eleanor Murphy from the diner testified about Harold's behavior during the search efforts, describing how he'd coordinated volunteers while carefully directing attention away from his own property. He was always the first to suggest new search areas, Eleanor said. Always helpful, always concerned, always ready to organize the next phase of looking. It never occurred to any of us that he was deliberately sending us in the wrong directions. Will's testimony came on the second day, after the prosecution had established the technical evidence and community context. D.A. Sharp had prepared him for defense attacks on his parenting, but walking to the witness stand still felt like facing judgment on the most difficult period of his life. Tell the jury about your relationship with your son, Sharp began, establishing the foundation of Will's love for Max before addressing Harold's attempts to undermine it. Will described their daily routines, Max's personality and interests, the challenges of single parenthood balanced against the joy of watching his son grow. He talked about bedtime stories and weekend adventures, school projects and playground visits, all the ordinary moments that had made their life together precious. The defendant suggested that you were an unfit parent, Sharp continued, that Max was better off in his care than yours. How do you respond to that characterization? Will looked at the jury, trying to find words that could convey the complexity of loving a child while struggling with grief and financial pressure. I wasn't a perfect parent, he said finally. I worked 2 jobs to support us, which meant less time together than either of us wanted. I was still learning how to balance everything after my wife died. But I loved Max completely, and everything I did was focused on giving him the best life I could provide. The defense cross-examination was as brutal as expected. Harold's attorney, a woman named Patricia Wells, attacked every aspect of Will's parenting with surgical precision. You worked 60 hours a week, correct? Leaving your 6-year-old son with babysitters and neighbors for extended periods. I worked to support my family. Max was never left unsupervised or uncared for, but you were taking prescription sleeping medication during the weeks before Max disappeared. After Max disappeared, the medication was prescribed to help me sleep during the search. Wells continued pressing, trying to create doubt about Will's fitness as a parent and suggest that Harold's actions had been motivated by genuine concern rather than predatory intent. But her strategy backfired when she tried to imply that Max had been happier in Harold's care. Your son adapted to Mr. Brennan's structured environment, didn't he? He followed rules, completed educational activities, maintained regular sleep schedules. My son was terrorized, Will replied, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. He was told his father didn't want him, played fabricated recordings of my voice rejecting him, and kept in an underground prison for 2 months. That's not structure, that's torture. Wells objected to Will's characterization, but the damage was done. The jury had heard a father's clear, angry response to suggestions that kidnapping had been beneficial to his child. Max's testimony, delivered via closed-circuit television from a specially prepared room adjoining the courtroom, was the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Dr. Reeves sat beside him, providing support while he answered questions in his small, clear voice. Can you tell us about the recordings Mr. Brennan played for you? The prosecutor asked gently. He said they were from my daddy, Max replied, his image filling the courtroom's video screens. Daddy saying he was tired of taking care of me and wanted me to go away. But they sounded wrong, like pieces stuck together. How did hearing those recordings make you feel? Scared and sad. I thought my daddy didn't love me anymore. The prosecution played excerpts from Harold's audio recordings, demonstrating how individual words and phrases had been spliced together to create messages Will had never spoken. The technical manipulation was obvious to adult listeners, but devastating to a child who had no reason to doubt what he was hearing. Did you want to stay in the underground room? The prosecutor continued. No, I wanted to go home. I asked Mr. Harold every day when I could see my daddy again. And he said maybe someday if I was very good and stopped asking questions. Harold showed no visible reaction to Max's testimony, maintaining the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the trial. But Will could see the jury's faces changing as they listened to his son describe months of psychological manipulation designed to break a child's spirit. When Wells cross-examined Max, she was careful to maintain a gentle tone while still challenging his account. Mr. Brennan took good care of you, didn't he? He made sure you had food and books and educational activities? He was mean, Max said simply. He told me my daddy didn't want me and made me live in the dark place underground. That's not taking care of someone. Wells tried several more approaches, attempting to show that Harold had provided better supervision and structure than Max had received at home. But Max's responses were consistent and clear. He had been unhappy, frightened, and desperate to return to his father throughout his captivity. Did your daddy ever yell at you or punish you at home? Wells asked, looking for evidence of the parental failures Harold had documented in his journals. Sometimes when I was bad, Max admitted, but he always said sorry afterward and explained why rules were important. And he never made me live underground or told me lies about not loving me. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Reeves, who testified about the psychological damage Harold's treatment had inflicted on Max. The defendant used sophisticated techniques to undermine this child's sense of reality and security, Dr. Reeves explained. The fabricated audio recordings, the isolation from familiar environment, the systematic destruction of trust in his parent, these were not the actions of someone providing care. They were deliberate methods of psychological control. As the first phase of the trial concluded, Will felt exhausted but hopeful. The evidence was overwhelming. Max's testimony had been clear and compelling, and the jury seemed genuinely horrified by Harold's actions. But he also knew that defense testimony would begin tomorrow, and Harold's team would work to paint their client as mentally ill rather than criminally responsible. The real battle for justice was just beginning. The guilty verdict document would become the most important piece of paper in Will's life, its official language transforming months of nightmare into legal closure. But sitting in the courtroom as the jury foreman read guilty on all counts, Will felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief or satisfaction, but a profound exhaustion that seemed to reach his bones. Harold's defense had lasted 3 days, built around psychiatric testimony that painted him as delusional rather than criminal. Dr. Marcus Webb, a forensic psychiatrist hired by the defense, had spent hours describing Harold's supposed belief that he was protecting Max from an unfit father. Mr. Brennan genuinely believed he was rescuing this child, Dr. Webb had testified. His actions were driven by a delusional disorder that made him unable to distinguish between perceived threats and actual danger. In his mind, he was providing salvation, not committing kidnapping. The defense strategy had been sophisticated, but ultimately unconvincing. Harold's meticulous planning, his systematic surveillance of multiple families, and his careful construction of an elaborate underground prison all argued against any claim of mental illness. This wasn't the impulsive action of someone who'd lost touch with reality. This was the methodical execution of a plan that had taken years to develop. D.A. Sharp had been particularly effective during his cross-examination of the defense's psychiatric witness. Doctor, would someone experiencing the delusional disorder you've described be capable of constructing a complex tunnel system over multiple years? Delusions don't necessarily impair technical abilities. Would they be capable of sophisticated audio editing to create fabricated recordings? Again, technical skills might remain intact. Would they be capable of maintaining a false persona for years while conducting surveillance on multiple families? Dr. Webb had been forced to admit that Harold's actions demonstrated a level of planning and deception that was inconsistent with the mental illness the defense was claiming. The prosecution's rebuttal had been swift and decisive. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a forensic psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, had reviewed all the evidence and reached a different conclusion entirely. Mr. Brennan's actions demonstrate clear understanding of right and wrong, Dr. Hendricks testified. He knew that kidnapping was illegal. That's why he constructed an elaborate underground hiding place. He knew that his surveillance was inappropriate. That's why he concealed it from neighbors and police. He knew that psychologically manipulating a child was harmful. That's why he went to such lengths to isolate Max from potential rescue. Harold himself had chosen not to testify, a decision that spoke volumes about his attorney's confidence in their case. Throughout the trial, he'd maintained an expression of mild confusion, as if he couldn't understand why his actions were being characterized as criminal. Will had studied Harold's face during Max's testimony, looking for some sign of remorse or recognition of the harm he'd caused. Instead, he'd seen only the same patient condescension Harold had displayed during their underground confrontation, the expression of someone who believed He knew better than everyone else what was best for Max. The jury deliberation had lasted 14 hours over 2 days. Will had spent that time in a conference room adjacent to the courthouse, unable to concentrate on anything except the 12 strangers who were deciding Harold's fate. Mrs. Chen had kept him company, bringing sandwiches he couldn't eat and coffee he couldn't taste. "They'll do the right thing," she'd said repeatedly, though Will could hear the uncertainty in her voice. High-profile cases sometimes produced unexpected verdicts, and Harold's defense team had been skilled at raising questions about his mental state. Max had remained in Dr. Reeves' care during the deliberation, shielded from the media attention and adult anxiety that surrounded the proceedings. He was doing better, sleeping through the night more often, asking fewer questions about whether Harold might escape and find him, but recovery was still measured in small daily improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom had been packed with reporters, community members, and families from other cases connected to Harold's pattern of predatory behavior. Will had felt the weight of their expectations as much as his own need for justice. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of psychological abuse of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. Each guilty verdict had felt like a small victory. But Will had remained tense until the final count was read. Harold was facing multiple charges, and a single not guilty verdict on any count would have felt like a partial vindication of his actions. Harold's reaction to the verdicts had been minimal, a slight tightening around his eyes, but no other visible response. His attorney had immediately begun discussing appeal options, but Harold himself had seemed almost disinterested in the legal maneuvering happening around him. The sentencing phase would come later, but D.A. Sharp had already indicated that he would seek the maximum penalties available under state law. Harold was looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would ensure he could never harm another child. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Chief Morrison, had thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. She'd also issued a protective order that would prevent Harold from any contact with Will or Max. Even from prison, the defendant is prohibited from sending letters, making phone calls, or communicating in any way with the victims or their family members, Judge Morrison had stated. This order extends to communication through third parties and will remain in effect for the duration of Mr. Brennan's incarceration. As the courtroom emptied, Will had felt a strange mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, but it felt incomplete somehow, as if no legal proceeding could truly address the violation of trust and safety that Harold's actions, represented Agent Torres, had approached him as he prepared to leave the courthouse. "This verdict will help us pursue the other cases," she'd said. "Harold's conviction establishes a pattern that will be crucial for investigating his activities in previous locations." Will hoped those investigations would bring closure to other families, but he was also ready to focus on rebuilding rather than looking backward. Max needed his father's attention on recovery and healing, not on the legal complexities of Harold's past crimes. The media attention following the verdict had been intense, but generally supportive. National news outlets had covered the case as an example of parental determination and community resilience in the face of sophisticated predatory behavior. Will had given one interview to the local newspaper, focusing on gratitude for the community support and Max's ongoing recovery, rather than details about Harold's actions. "My son is alive and safe," he'd said simply. "That's what matters most. Everything else is just making sure Harold can never hurt another family." The community response had been remarkable. People who'd barely known Will before Max's disappearance had become genuine friends during the search and trial. The shared experience of being deceived by Harold had created bonds that would last long after the legal proceedings concluded. Mrs. Chen had been particularly changed by the experience. Her guilt over trusting Harold had transformed into fierce protectiveness toward Will and Max, and she'd appointed herself unofficial guardian of their family's privacy and security. "We all learned something about how predators operate," she'd said during one of their conversations about the trial. Harold didn't look dangerous because dangerous people often don't. They look helpful and trustworthy, right up until the moment they're not. The verdict had also brought clarity to the community about how Harold had manipulated them all. His helpfulness during the search hadn't been genuine concern. It had been a way to monitor the investigation and ensure it didn't get too close to the truth. His offers to help with practical matters hadn't been neighborly kindness, they'd been opportunities to gather information about Will's vulnerabilities and Max's routines. Even his expression of grief over losing his own wife hadn't been honest emotion. It had been a fabricated persona designed to elicit sympathy and trust from people he was actively deceiving. Will drove home from the courthouse, guilty verdict in hand. He thought about the long journey from that snowy afternoon at Riverside Park to this moment of legal closure. Max was alive, Harold was convicted, and their family could finally begin moving forward without the shadow of ongoing legal proceedings. But he also understood that the real work of healing was just beginning. The guilty verdict was an ending to one chapter of their story, but it was also the beginning of whatever came next. For the first time in months, Will felt ready to find out what that might be. The new house keys felt different from any others Will had ever held, heavier somehow, weighted with possibility rather than necessity. The modest two-story colonial in Millbrook sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, far enough from Cedar Falls to represent a fresh start, but close enough that Mrs. Chen could visit on weekends. 6 months had passed since Harold's conviction, and Max was thriving in ways that still surprised Will daily. The move had been Dr. Reeves's suggestion, not an escape from their past, but a chance to build new memories in a place untainted by trauma. "Good morning, buddy," Will said, watching Max carefully arrange his school supplies on the kitchen table that had become their homework station. The 8-year-old had grown 2 inches since the trial, his copper hair catching morning light that streamed through windows he'd helped choose during their house-hunting expedition. "I need help with my book report," Max said, holding up a paperback copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins. "Mrs. Patterson says I have to explain why Karana was brave." Will smiled at the assignment. Max's new teacher had a gift for selecting books that resonated with children who'd overcome difficult experiences. Stories about survival and resilience had become Max's favorites, perhaps because they reflected his own journey from victim to survivor. The therapy sessions with Dr. Reeves continued twice a week, though they'd evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing support for a child learning to trust the world again. Max still had nightmares occasionally, still flinched when adults moved too quickly behind him, but he was laughing more often than he was afraid. "I think Karana was brave because she didn't give up," Max said, working through his thoughts aloud. "Even when she was scared and alone, she kept trying to survive." "That sounds like a good start," Will agreed, pouring coffee into the mug Max had picked out for Father's Day, ceramic, painted with World's Best Dad in careful 8-year-old handwriting that was much steadier than his 6-year-old version had been. Their morning routine had become precious to Will in ways he'd never appreciated. Before Max's disappearance, the ordinary moments, breakfast conversations, homework help, the minor negotiations about clothing choices and weather-appropriate jackets felt like gifts rather than obligations. Will's new job as maintenance supervisor at Millbrook High School came with better hours and health insurance that covered Max's therapy sessions. The work was satisfying in immediate, tangible ways, fixing things that were broken, maintaining spaces where children learned and grew. The principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had hired him despite knowing about their family's recent trauma, understanding that his protective instincts would make him particularly attentive to student safety. The dog had been Max's idea, proposed during a family meeting where they discussed what their new life in Millbrook should include. Hope was a golden retriever mix from the local shelter, chosen because she was calm with children and had survived her own difficult past. She knows what it's like to be scared, Max had explained when they'd first met Hope at the shelter. But look how happy she is now that she's safe. Hope had integrated into their family with the easy grace of an animal who understood the value of security and routine. She slept beside Max's bed, walked with them to the school bus stop, and seemed to intuitively understand when either of them needed extra comfort. Mrs. Chen's weekend visits had become a cornerstone of their new routine. She'd sold her house in Cedar Falls and moved to a senior community 30 minutes away, claiming she needed to be closer to her boys for whatever time she had left. "How's the book report coming?" she asked, arriving for their Saturday morning ritual with homemade cookies and gentle questions about Max's week. "I'm writing about brave people who survive scary things," Max replied, accepting a hug that he no longer rationed but distributed freely to the adults who'd proven themselves trustworthy. Will watched Mrs. Chen interact with Max, marveling at how seamlessly she'd become the grandmother his son had never known. Her guilt over trusting Harold had transformed into fierce protectiveness and unconditional love that enriched all their lives. "Mrs. Chen," Max said, settling beside her with his notebook, "do you think Mr. Harold was scared when he did those bad things?" The question caught both adults off guard. Max rarely mentioned Harold anymore, and when he did, it was usually in the context of therapy sessions rather than casual conversation. Mrs. Chen considered the question seriously, understanding that Max's developing sense of empathy needed honest answers rather than simplified explanations. "I think Mr. Harold was sick in his mind," she said carefully. "Scared people sometimes make very bad choices, but that doesn't excuse hurting others. What he did to you was wrong, no matter what he was feeling inside." Max nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Reeves says some people's brains don't work right, so they can't tell the difference between helping and hurting." "That's right," Will added. "But that's why we have police and judges and prisons, to keep everyone safe from people whose brains don't work properly." The conversation was one of many they'd had about Harold's motivations and mental state. Dr. Reeves had emphasized the importance of helping Max understand that predatory behavior was a choice, not an inevitability, while also acknowledging the complex psychological factors that created dangerous people. Harold's sentencing had brought a form of closure that felt more complete than the guilty verdict. Life imprisonment without parole meant he would never again have the opportunity to harm children or manipulate families. The other investigations Agent Torres had mentioned were proceeding slowly, but Harold's conviction had already helped prosecutors in 2 other states file charges related to missing children cases. Will had chosen not to attend the sentencing hearing, focusing instead on Max's recovery and their plans for moving forward. Dr. Reeves had supported that decision, emphasizing that healing was more important than witnessing punishment. "The justice system did its job," she'd said. "Now your job is building a good life for yourself and Max." The advocacy work had found Will rather than the other way around. Families dealing with missing children cases had reached out for advice and support, drawn by media coverage of Max's recovery and Harold's conviction. Will had started responding to their calls and emails, offering practical guidance about working with police, managing media attention, and maintaining hope during extended searches. "You understand what we're going through in ways that other people can't," one mother had told him during a phone conversation about her missing daughter. "You know what it feels like to have everyone suspect you while your child is somewhere else, scared and calling for you." The conversations were difficult but meaningful, providing Will with a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own family's healing. He'd learned that many missing children cases involved predators who'd inserted themselves into the search efforts, just as Harold had done. "Trust your instincts," he'd advised more than one parent. "If someone seems too helpful, too knowledgeable about your family's routines, too eager to direct the search away from certain areas. Those are red flags worth investigating. Max's 8th birthday had been a celebration of survival and healing rather than just another year of growing up. They'd invited his new friends from school, along with Mrs. Chen and Dr. Reeves, and several neighbors who'd become part of their extended family in Millbrook. The party had taken place in their backyard, where Max and Hope had spent hours playing while Will watched from the deck and marveled at his son's resilience. This was the childhood Max deserved, filled with laughter and friends and the security of knowing he was safe and loved. "Make a wish," Will had said, as Max prepared to blow out 8 candles shaped like soccer balls, his current obsession. Max had closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them with a grin that reminded Will powerfully of Sarah. "I wished for more days like this," Max had said simply. The wish had already come true in ways both large and small. Their life in Millbrook was built on ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they'd come so close to losing the chance to experience them. School pick-up at 3:15, with Max running toward the car full of stories about his day. Homework sessions at the kitchen table, with Hope providing moral support from her spot near Max's feet. Weekend adventures to the local park, where Max played with children who knew nothing about his past trauma, and saw only a boy who was funny and kind and good at soccer. The therapy sessions had evolved into monthly check-ins, with Dr. Reeves helping Max develop tools for managing the occasional anxiety that still surfaced around certain triggers. Dark spaces still bothered him, and he was more cautious around strangers than most children his age. But these were reasonable adaptations rather than debilitating fears. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting," Dr. Reeves had explained during one of their family sessions. "It means learning to carry difficult experiences without letting them control your choices." Max was learning that lesson with the adaptability that made children remarkable. He'd chosen to share his story with close friends when questions arose about why he sometimes had bad dreams or needed extra reassurance during sleepovers. The other children had responded with the matter-of-fact compassion that 8-year-olds could display when presented with honest information. "That's really scary," his best friend Jake had said after hearing a simplified version of Max's experience. "But you're safe now, right?" "Right," Max had confirmed, "and my dad knows how to make sure I stay safe." Will's relationship with safety had evolved as well. The hypervigilance that had been necessary during the search and trial had gradually relaxed into appropriate caution. He knew where Max was at all times, without hovering obsessively. He maintained awareness of their surroundings without assuming danger lurked behind every interaction. The balance was delicate but achievable, being protective without being paralyzed by fear, teaching Max to be careful without making him afraid of the world. Winter in Millbrook brought the first real test of their emotional recovery. Snow had always been associated with the day Max disappeared, and Will had worried that the approaching winter might trigger difficult memories for both of them. Instead, Max had approached the first snowfall with excitement rather than anxiety. "Can we build a snowman?" he'd asked, pressing his face against their living room window as fat flakes began accumulating in their yard. They'd spent the afternoon in their backyard, with Hope bounding through the snow while Max and Will constructed an elaborate snow fort that rivaled anything from their old life in Cedar Falls. The difference was that this fort was built for joy rather than survival, decorated with colorful flags and equipped with a slide that sent Hope tumbling into snowdrifts with delighted barks. "This is better than my underground fort," Max had said, admiring their creation. "Because it's outside where everyone can see it and because we built it together." The comment had been casual, but it represented a milestone in Max's processing of his experience. He could now speak about the underground chamber without distress, understanding it as something that had happened to him rather than something that defined him. That evening, as they'd warmed up with hot chocolate by their fireplace, Max had made an observation that crystallized how much their family had grown. "Daddy, I know why bad things happen to us." Will had tensed. worried that Max was developing some misplaced sense of responsibility for Harold's actions. "Why's that, buddy?" "So we could help other kids who have bad things happen to them. Like when you talk to those other parents on the phone, or when Dr. Reeves uses our story to teach other doctors how to help scared children." The 8-year-old's wisdom had taken Will's breath away. Max understood intuitively what many adults struggled to grasp, that surviving trauma could become a source of strength and purpose rather than just a burden to carry. "You're right," Will had said, pulling his son closer on the couch where they'd been reading together. "Sometimes the hardest things we go through become ways to help other people. And sometimes," Max had added with the kind of insight that reminded Will daily of Sarah's influence, "scary things that happen make us appreciate the good things more." The anniversary of Max's disappearance had passed quietly, marked by a private visit to Dr. Reeves and a family dinner where they'd talked about how far they'd all come. Will had worried about the date for weeks, but Max had handled it with remarkable maturity. "It's not a sad day anymore," he'd said. "It's the day that started our adventure of learning how strong we are, as spring arrived in Millbrook, bringing the kind of gentle warmth that made everything seem possible." Will reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place of peace and hope. Harold's actions had shattered their sense of security and forced them to rebuild their understanding of trust and safety, but they'd emerged from that rebuilding process, stronger than they'd been before, not because trauma was beneficial, but because they'd chosen to meet it with love, determination, and mutual support. Max was thriving in ways that honored both his resilience and his childhood. He was learning to play piano, excelling at soccer, and developing friendships based on shared interests rather than shared trauma. He was growing into the person he would have become anyway, just with additional layers of empathy and strength. Will had found his own sense of purpose, both in his work at the school and in his informal role as a resource for other families facing similar crises. Helping others navigate the aftermath of predatory crimes provided meaning that transformed his own painful experience into something useful and healing. Their life in Millbrook wasn't perfect, no. Life ever was, but it was theirs. Built on foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and unconditional love that had proven strong enough to survive the worst anyone could imagine. As Will watched Max and Hope play in their backyard on a sunny Saturday morning, Mrs. Chen reading nearby and the smell of her weekend cookies drifting from the kitchen, he felt something he'd thought he might never experience again. Simple, uncomplicated happiness. Max looked up from his game of fetch with hope, catching his father's eye and grinning with the kind of pure joy that made everything else worthwhile. "I love our life." "Daddy," he called across the yard, "I love it too." "Buddy," Will called back, meaning it completely. Behind them, the house that had become their sanctuary stood solid and welcoming, its windows reflecting the spring sunlight and its rooms filled with the everyday miracles of a family that had survived the unthinkable and chosen to build something beautiful from the pieces that remained. They were home, they were safe, and they were together. After everything they'd endured, that felt like the most remarkable victory of all.